Competence versus performance. Does this ring a bell?
Good morning. I don't know if this would sort of like fits, but is this like how well do you speak and understand the language versus how you like I have it on the tip of my tongue, I'm sorry. Versus how you, I guess, express yourself in that language.
Exactly. Something like that. Yeah, exactly. So very much competence. It's the stuff that is unseen, the stuff that we don't really know about, the stuff that goes on in the mind. So what does it mean to know language in the mind? And I feel like that's even perhaps the most difficult part of linguistics, trying to figure out what happens in the mind, because there's so much that we don't know. And we have methods that try to arrive at understanding what people do when they speak and when they listen. For instance, we may give people tasks to complete under a certain time frame, or como que, we can like do psychological experiments on them or laboratory-based experiments on them, and connect their heads to different technologies. For instance, one of the famous ones is fMRI, that looks at imaging, neuroimaging frameworks of our head. Como que it gives you like little maps of the little regions that are activated of the brain whenever we listen, whenever we speak bilingually or monolingually. So there are things that try to kind of figure out what happens with language in the mind. So according to Chomsky, that's competence. So knowledge of any language is competence, happens in our minds, and it's innate. Performance, however, it's what can be seen. It's the output. Competence is the input, performance is the output. So very much sociolinguists and applied linguists and linguistic anthropologists, people that look at language in society, they're interested in the aspect of this performative aspect, because it's something that can be seen, measured, and you can see how people interact with other people, how people react, right? So it's a little bit, they're both, I feel like perhaps sociolinguists, like they both have their own credit, their own strengths, and they both communicate something different about language. So from a Chomskyan point of view, a linguist's primary focus should be understanding what speakers know about their language in terms of competence, not performance, not the idea of, oh, wait, when I'm in this formal context, I'm supposed to speak very formally because of the nature of the ideologies attached to this space. Que formal, yo estoy en una entrevista, or I'm like in school, so I'm expected to speak a certain way and I can't cuss, etc. I can't use too many fillers like because I won't be taken seriously. For Chomskyans and generative grammarians, they don't answer these kinds of questions of language ideologies, norms, and appropriacy, cultural appropriateness. They're more interested in other questions like, is there a way, like, are there any universalities across different contexts, across different dialects, across different countries in terms of how people use language? And if there are any universalities of how people use language, can we come up with a sort of algorithm or a set of rules that talks about, for instance, language syntax, so the structure of language that could represent all of the different languages of the world? And that's kind of like really, he has many different theories and many different stances, but he's very much interested in capturing what's universal in the language, what's universal to you and me. And I suppose from a biological standpoint, so what's innate to everyone. So in this concern with defining language as a biological entity, he decides to focus on competence, which is what's in the mind. That's fair. So Chomsky places less emphasis on production performance of language, that is, what speakers can do with their language or what they do with their language. So here's a quote from Chomsky. Does anyone want to read it?
I could read it.
Dale, Dashiell, go ahead.
Linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows its language perfectly and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors, random or characteristic, in applying his knowledge of the language in actual performance. This seems to me to have been the position of the founders of modern general linguistics, and no concrete reason for modifying it has been offered. Yeah, Chomsky, 1965.
Oof, gracias, Dashiell. So if we look at this quote, there's a lot of different meanings to unpack. Firstly, I suppose it's kind of overwhelming because he's speaking about language using very much field-specific jargon. Eso está lleno de jargon. Mira todo eso, memory limitations, distractions. So let's break it down. Let's go through the first part. So the first part, linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-listener. What do you think he means by an ideal speaker-listener? Who's that? Who's the ideal speaker or listener?
Is it based primarily on, what is considered to be the standard version of the language?
Probably. Okay. I don't even know. I think that's what he means. Like the ideal speaker listener would be observing language without any external outside influence. So language, I suppose, laboratory based, the ideal would be that, approaching the standard. Yeah. But yeah, the ideal, whatever that is, speaker listener in a completely homogeneous speech community. Yeah, that's interesting. So in a completely homogeneous speech community. So do any examples come to mind that you could see a ideal speaker listener in a homogeneous speech community? So quote the 1965 Chomsky. Who's the ideal speaker in a homogeneous community? Any examples?
I guess it would be the native speaker.
Exacto. The native speaker speaking in a perfect standard language in a maybe monolingual context. So, Chomsky, it's not very fair to talk about the stuff that he says or that he said 50 years ago or over 50 years ago, because he said a lot of things since then. But I suppose, he based all of his current work on syntax, on generative grammar that we're going to talk about soon, and universal grammar, which is also a theory of his. He based all of his current work on stuff that he said in the past. So, the problem that I suppose sociolinguists have with this is that, from a perspective of a sociolinguist, which is me, how can you talk about a homogeneous speech community? What does a homogeneous speech community look like? Because even in monolingual contexts where everyone's a first language speaker, there's a lot of variation. Not everybody has access to the same vocabulary. Some people have access to education that leads them to to learn complex sentence structures or more vocabulary words than other people, right? So is it fair, I suppose, to talk about any language community as homogeneous when you and I don't speak the same? Like you and I have different life experiences. And even especially today, in the world that we live today, with technology and shifts in mobility, migratory movements, can we even philosophize of an ideal speaker, whatever that is, in a what is a like, you know, on the internet, a homogeneous community? So for me, as a sociolinguist who looks at all of these other aspects that influence language change, so how people move back and forth, how technologies and historical context influence how people speak and how we change language. For me, it's kind of problematic to even, I suppose, philosophize about this idea. But maybe if I sat down with Chomsky, estuviese aquí al lado mío, he would give me some solid arguments that would maybe make it better than whatever he said in this back then in 1965. Maybe, you know, he's had a lot of time to talk to other academics and refine what he first said. So yeah, so who knows its language perfectly? So what is knowing a language perfectly according to who? According to grammar books that we were talking about, prescriptive grammar books? Or does like cultural specific knowledge come into knowing a language perfectly? And is unaffected by such grammaticality, irrelevant conditions as memory limitations. So this ideal speaker listener doesn't have memory lapses or lapses in memory. No tiene limitaciones. I suppose when he talks about memory limitations, he's not talking about it in such a like basic introductory way. He's probably talking about like impediments, like learning impediments, no? So somebody que no tiene esos problemas would be the ideal speaker listener. Distractions, so somebody with psychological issues, maybe the ADHD, no sé. Shifts of attention and interest. So basically he's referring to like psychological individual differences of any condition that could affect how people use language. And errors, random or characteristic, in applying his knowledge of the language in actual performance. So that's really the ideal speaker. And we do, I suppose we can, if we think back in our experiences of learning a language and interacting with people, maybe we can think of people que se expresan súper bien, que we rarely ever hear any like weird construction of language from them or any sort of deviation from pronunciation, etc. Although Chomsky's mostly concerned with syntax, but maybe we can think of people que son dotados en idioma, or that, you know, they succeed more than others. Maybe those kind of people would be the ideal speaker listener for this kind of study. But again, I suppose my question as a sociolinguist would be, and you know, there are psychology articles that talk about gente que son dotada en idioma, people that are talented at learning languages, music, math, right? But my question would be, what sort of societal circumstances, I suppose, led them to this, if any, or were they always this way from birth? I just feel like that kind of question is very difficult to answer for everybody. I mean, surely there are people that are just really good with learning symbolic systems, rules and stuff, but not everyone is that way. So it seems very ideal to me. It seems admirable to even come up with such a universal perspective of language, but it seems very ideal to me. At least that's me. So study of language is no different from empirical investigation of other complex phenomena. Chomsky says, I believe that everyone feels this way in linguistics. It's very much the case that even sociolinguists and cognitive linguist and neurolinguist, we're all sort of concerned with trying to be as objective as possible about language, how language is used in a speech community, right? That's why we define ourselves and we position ourselves as a social science rather than like a humanities-based field. And we do investigations and we do research methods as would any other science. We do our observations, our hypothesis of those observations, and then we kind of decide on the methods based on our research questions and hypotheses. We go through the scientific method for all of the fields, all of the studies of linguistics. So I suppose in this case, I will have to agree that language is no different from any other investigation of complex phenomena in our human experience. So he does have a lot of nice quotables. So no se puede descreditar Chomsky. He's one of our modern day intellectuals. Then we have Steven Pinker, which is another one of our modern day intellectuals. Funny story is that Steven Pinker, his background isn't necessarily in linguistics per se, but he's actually a cognitive psychologist, and he's based at Harvard University, I think. So yeah, so Steven Pinker, a Harvard cognitive linguist, well, I call him cognitive linguist, but he's really a psychologist, criticizes Chomskyan approaches, comparing it to like the physicist frictionless plan and ideal gas. Can anyone maybe like explain that a little bit to me? So they like the physicist frictionless plan and ideal gas. What do you think Steven Pinker is referring to when he talks about Chomskyan theory like that? Como que, what does that mean to you?
That maybe Chomsky's way of looking at language is a bit limited, considering just how truly complex language and the context of language actually is.
Exactly, Daphne, very good. It's very much theoretical, como hypothetical. Se queda in its own hypothetical laboratory, everything, all the variables are controlled world. But I say frictionless and ideal, no? Even for those of us who don't really understand physics, we would still understand what he's getting at with this comparison or with this analogy. So he further argues that a real language is constantly being pushed and pulled at the margins by different speakers in different ways. So in this case, even though he's like a neuroscience psychologist, he's sounding a lot like people that approach language from a more sociological framework, that they acknowledge the evolution of language change, and how all of so many different factors influence how people end up speaking and how language changes throughout time. They're constantly being pushed and pulled by different directions. Así se ve en sociolingüística. That's why a subfield or a subspecialty under sociolinguistics is the study of variation and change. So I suppose in this sense, a lot of the times when people think about Chomskyan, generative grammar people, universal grammar, and sociolinguists, a lot of people would interpret them as belonging to like opposite ends of the theoretical pole. Como que bien como no se habla mucho, no colaboran mucho, although there have been some recent stuff on sociocognitive approaches to language, which is awesome. But, a fault, I suppose, of linguistics, and I suspect many other fields también, is that people latch on to their theoretical area. Y pues no se habla mucho. And you don't really see conferences that entrelazan los temas. So you can have people that are interested in bilingualism from like the Chomskyan perspective, and they would be elsewhere. And then people from a sociolinguistic position or applied, and they go to AAL, que es la Association of American Applied Linguistics. Toda esa gente se va para allá. People that are more cognitive and formal se van para LSA, que Linguistic Society of America, o se van para otra cosa. So like you do even have this divide in terms of how like academics socialize, even dentro del departamento, which I think is quite silly because there is a lot of mutual ground. But actually, I have seen cases where I've seen collaboration between people, so that's cool. But yeah, it's interesting how Pinker, who is a psychologist himself from neuroscience, he's kind of hinting here at the importance of looking at the messiness of language. So from a sociolinguist perspective, we are primarily concerned with real language. So for us, what does real language mean? So for us, it's not the case that, you know, what happens in our mind isn't real language. We acknowledge that every human has the capacity to acquire a language that's innate and built into our brain. The little blueprints, no? Predispositions, cognitive native predispositions that we have, and how like parental input or surroundings kind of like la reglan, right? So we do acknowledge the role of the mind, but when we talk about real language, I suppose we're kind of standing in stark contrast to this idea of the ideal speaker in the homogeneous world or context. Because when you think about it, most contexts in the world are multilingual or bilingual, and fewer contexts in the world are monolingual. So I suppose when I first learned about Chomsky as an undergrad, my first thought in like listening to his ideas, I had a very extremist thought to him. And I think it's because when he's taught in linguistics classes, his stances and his theories are simplified. They kind of make you hate him, especially, no sé si en este departamento. But, he's published a lot and he's still, doing a lot of influential work. So I think that maybe we should approach any criticism of him con pinza and then be like, I'm gonna look it up on my own and see what he's saying today. A ver si ha cambiado, or if it makes sense a little bit. But for sociolinguists, when we talk about real language, I suppose we talk about it outside of these laboratory settings, which is perhaps one of the most important things that differentiates sociolinguists to formal linguists, that, they do the scientific method, pero desde una perspectiva bien controlada, with their control group and their experimental group. We're interested in performance, so we don't think that competence va primero que performance. We actually probably see competence and performance a la par. That performance is just a reflection of someone's competence. Specifically, we also have different definitions for competence. We don't just talk about competence of knowing a language in the mind, but sociolinguists also talk about the idea of cultural competence or communicative competence, okay? A competence with knowing when to say what under what context. So appropriateness of language, saber las reglas del idioma. Eso es communicative competence for us, como que saber las reglas sociales. So we do talk about competence, but not the kind of some ideal speaker in an ideal situation que no tiene disabilities or, all the other things. And that's a quote from our book, 2015. So theoretical concerns influence methodological choices. So the fact that we're interested in performance or language use are ultimately going to influence our research questions, how the devices that we turn to address those research questions. So for instance, syntacticians like Chomsky, who do generative grammar, they'll probably use methodological choices like what is known as grammatical judgment, which are tasks that you give to your participants, que son como exámenes, where you ask participants maybe to grade a set of sentences and detect whether those sentences have any grammatical inaccuracies or whether you believe que ese sentence está correcto. So he would probably do those kind of like tests or those methodological exercises. to arrive at an understanding of, okay, este el grammatical competence of the person I'm assessing, according to how they did in that judgment exercise. While sociolinguists would probably not use those kind of exercises, but maybe go to like a real life scenario, like a school, a classroom, or outside, interact with people, interview them, and elicit recordings of their language use. Then they would try to drop, they would anotar, transcribe the grammatical patterns. Then they would detect the trends in grammar use. And then they would make an observation based on the recording. This syntactic structure was common in Egi Oye Persona in my recording of natural language use. Daphne.
So in the case of the exercises, would they, like the researchers, would they actually offer the exact same types of exercises regardless of the linguistic community, or
For
would
the
they,
grammatical judgment.
yes, like, or
No.
would they, vary?
No, the grammatical judgment test would, they would change according to language and context. The linguists involved would take into consideration maybe stuff in their standardized languages. But the thing with theoretical linguists is that they never forget about the standard. Para ellos, el standard es universal grammar. So it would probably be based around that. But actually, I have seen sociolinguistic papers that have grammatical judgment tests, pero son bien viejitos, como de los 90. But right now, sociolinguists would do their language gathering through recordings. Esa es the most popular method, through recordings. You could have people do tasks, but recordings always take a part of that. And in terms of syntacticians like Chomsky, well, I'm not quite sure much about their methods besides grammaticality judgment tests. But I can say for certain, and I suppose you probably also know this, Daphne, that even like people, maybe let's say a formal linguist or alguien que se considera Chomskyan or generativist, but does sort of psychology work that looks at the developmental stages of language acquisition. They would probably incorporate recordings of children interacting with their caretakers in un cuarto. And you give the child a specific toy or whatever, and you ask them to do a task and you record them. And I suppose that would be based a little bit more on that side of the spectrum of developmental stages, psychology of language use. And yeah, but there are many different methods to describing people's competence. I suppose what we're trying to talk about here. There are many different methods, and very much your research question, or whether you do it from a Chomskyan generativist perspective, whether you do it from a more psychological developmental perspective, or whether you do it from more a social perspective, that's going to influence the tools you resort to. So this is why it's always useful as well, if you're thinking about, hi, it would be cool to do this kind of study, to turn to like research methods books of that specific field, porque todos los research methods books te van a dar diferente idea of how to do it. So a sociolinguist concern is that a language is more than the knowledge of grammar. So it's more than what we just know in our mind, what's genetically endowed, the blueprints, the mechanisms, the computational mechanisms. Speakers in their performance also behave systematically. And what better record do they have of that than data that shows a picture that is trend driven, that's statistical, numerical? Hay muchos sociolinguistas that base their findings and their conclusions on recurring language use. No one will tell you or write a paper about something that happened once. Their actions are not random. There is order in how people use language in society. So as I mentioned before, we are concerned with competence, but specifically I suspect more communicative competence que el competence social, que el competence cognitivo, which yields different kinds of questions and different kinds of methods to that question. Still cool, but not really, doesn't tend to be a sociolinguistic concern. So knowing a language also means knowing how to use a language for sociolinguists, knowing how to use it. What exactly does this mean? So knowing a language also means knowing how to use a language. So knowing how to use a language in a particular social context, knowing the social rules behind a particular language use or linguistic feature. Por ejemplo, inclusive language has gained a lot of currency in the youth of today in Puerto Rico, specifically people that are in the LGBTQ community, but also people that are like, consider themselves feminists, and people who generally believe in the costs of inclusive language, like educators and etc. So they know the social rules of, this is language that's gaining currency, specifically in the youth, but si voy al trabajo, I can't fully embrace my inclusive language because there's some people that are more linguistically conservative. So they may see my use of inclusive language maybe as a colloquialism. So someone who knows a language would know these kind of social meanings or cultural constructs, and they would know how to use it in an appropriate language. They would know the fluid meaning of language. So basically, the idea that a linguistic form, for instance, vamos a dar un ejemplo bien simple, la palabra cabrón has more than one meaning for Puerto Rico, right? Well, knowing a language, you would know all of the multiple meanings that a word or a phrase or a sentence structure would have. So cabrón in Puerto Rico can be between panas, cabrón, right? If you're angry with someone, it could be cabrón, on the road. O este cabrón, los hombres son cabrones, right? It could have different meanings. So yeah, sociolinguistics would deal with the multiplicity of meanings in language, not just a single meaning or like the perfect meaning, but also acknowledge that language changes and acquires new meaning through time. For instance, si hacemos un ejercicio bien chévere, which I think we will do in the future, that I've done it with some of my other classes, which is explore the Oxford English Dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary tiene un compendio bien excelente of the history of a word. So the etymology, they've been doing their work for many years now and very successfully so. So like they have the first occurrence ever, or the first documented occurrence of a lot of words, como que de los 1800, 1700, until now. And when you see how words change and how they're used across sentences, como que you're able to see how a word has changed in how it's used, meaning that it's also changed in terms of how people use that word in terms of meaning. Por ejemplo, la palabra dumb antes significaba alguien que no escuchaba, que tenía hearing impediments. And now it means someone who's not intelligent. It's kind of like a mean beginning, pero, it's kind of, it gives you an insight to society. Or la palabra bear, I think that in some context or some time in the past was used to talk about Black people. Eso lo había enseñado yo en una clase de lexicography, pero tengo que buscar the exact reference, so don't quote me on bear. Pero dumb es como que se sabe, por eso es que dice dumb and deaf and dumb, whatever. But yeah, so multiplicity meaning across time, across context, across social spaces, tonalities give difference in meanings. Un ejemplo de cabrón. Knowing about human social relations and the role language plays in them. Also, again, super important, again, vamos al ejemplo de cabrón. If I'm a linguist or an anthropologist and I decide I'm gonna look at el idioma en el género urbano, so for me to assess how language is used, I would have to have a really good insight or like really good knowledge of estos dos son panitas. So that's why se hablan tan explícitamente. But then si estos dos no son panitas y se están tirando ahí en un rap, actually they hate each other, right? So I would have to know about cómo se llevan, what's their like rapport, whether they have any history together, what's the cultural context, what are the norms of that context. So a lot of different things. So knowing about the different ways of saying the same thing, variation, es un keyword, different ways of saying the same thing, una sola idea, tiene diferentes representaciones, is the study of language variation, que es una rama de sociolingüística. And we're also interested in the meaning of this variation. So certain forms are interpreted as X y otros forms as Z. Por ejemplo, inclusive language is interpreted as advanced or progressive language in Puerto Rico. But if I keep going on my day y me meto a un feminist or LGBTQ, un gender rights conference, usando los pronouns tradicionales, I'm probably going to be chastised and not seen as aware. So yeah, so social meaning is important. So language is variable for us, for sociolinguists. It is a living entity. No es algo que como que ideal, homogeneous, que no cambia. Language is not static. Language is subject to change. Even the idea of what Daphne mentioned, whether the ideal speaker would be la persona que habla el estándar, because we're starting to talk about sociolinguistics. A lot of you don't know what standard language is, but standard language es la idea del prototipo. Like there's a prototype of every single language, Spanish to English, of the perfect way of speaking that language, of the more correct way. Vamos a decir. So standard language is essentially the language that you see represented in the dictionaries, in grammar books. That's standard language. So for us sociolinguists, yes, we would be interested in standard language, but we would also be interested in the alternative, which is the real world, accented language. Como las personas difieren, dialects that are based on ethnic groups, religious groups, class groups, etc. So language is alive. It's not static. It's not something that can be covered by one grammar book or even a series of grammar books. It's something that is a lifetime project. Por eso es que tú ves dictionary makers or people that are involved with codifying language are always looking at trends of the internet and how languages are changing. So linguistic variation is a central topic to much sociolinguistic research. Work under this paradigm is known as the variationist paradigm. It studies different ways of saying the same thing, also known as variants, la variante. Some examples of variants: the car needs washed. The car needs to be washed. The car needs washing. So out of these three, which forms would you use en tu habla coloquial? So which variant would you use in your talk, in your speech? Hello?
I thought someone. Oh, sorry. I thought someone else had unmuted, and I was like, oh, is it me? Is it them? Well, at least and to answer your question, when I talk, I would probably use the car needs to be washed.
And you know what's really interesting about that is that a lot of the variation, especially within English, sucede más en monolingual context, because especially syntactic variation, because us as second language speakers, nuestro contacto con inglés es con los libros muchas veces. Tecnología sí, but you know, we're taught the rules of the grammatical rules of language, etc. So a lot of the times what tends to happen, what is a feature, a characteristic of second language speakers is that actually nosotros hablamos bien formal en nuestro segundo idioma. More formal, we end up using more formal syntactic structures than people that so monolingual. Por ejemplo, the first one, the car needs washed. That construction happens in monolingual settings. Specifically, the African American English speaking community would use that first construction. They get rid a veces with this to be. Sometimes they omit that to be, which are auxiliary verbs, verbo auxiliare. And it's totally grammatical in their context, and people are understood. The car needs washed. And nobody thinks it's incorrect. People only think it's incorrect si ve a alguien of the African American English community interacting with a white person. Then a white person would chastise them y decirle que están hablando mal. But that's a feature of African American English, ese primer ejemplo. The second example, the car needs to be washed, is perhaps the most formal one, because tiene los dos verbos, los auxiliares, to be, and wash, el pretérito. So the longest, more complicated construction. The second construction, washing, lo tiene en el progresivo, present progressive, the car needs washing. Ese también se ve como que more standard, but interesting how the first one would be seen in some contexts as incorrect, even though there's a lot of dialects and English speakers that use that first one. But again, these are different examples of saying the same thing. So variation exists at all levels of the human existence. We can think about body shape variation. We can think about gender variation that we're coming to terms with right now. And we can think about some variation in language, in DNA and in language. Language is not exempt to this. So it reflects the different ways that people speak in different regions or groups, the study of language variation. Variation is in existence, even not just between groups, but even within a single speaker. That's why a lot of people that do language sciences, a lot of cognitive, like anyone de cualquier rama de lingüística, usually if you're analyzing someone's speech, you would want to analyze that person's speech based on a series of different tasks or different questions rather than like a one-time thing. Because you need to account for the potential variation that you may encounter in a single person. Porque la persona puede sonar diferente according to like their mental, emotional state, si su cansancio, whatever, whether they're drunk. Esos son como que weird circumstances. But also according to who they're talking to, audience, context, ideologies, etc. So language changes even within a single speaker. So no one speaker sounds the same. People constantly exploit variation within the languages they speak. So si eres monolingüe, si eres bilingual, even people that are monolingual, let's say we're talking about the African American community, even they speak differently. They wouldn't necessarily all use the car needs washed. Maybe in educational contexts or in contexts that are high stakes, they would use the more formal way because they know the social meaning of it and they know that their speech is stigmatized, no? So people constantly exploit their knowledge of language for a wide variety of purposes. Somos strategic with our language use a lot of times. So this is, I suppose, a link that I'm gonna ask you guys to explore, porque ya son las 8:17. We can pick it up here from this slide on Wednesday. And you can like have a look at this link in your own time. And then when we pick it up on Wednesday, we can explore the link together and talk a little bit about that. It's a PBS. That website is based on a documentary of what it means to speak American. un PBS documentary. So have a look at that link and explore it a little bit. And then we come back and we discuss and that we pick it up talking about the lasting subjects of key concepts in sociolinguistics, okay? Any questions about Chomsky performance versus competence, methodological choices so far? ¿Estamos bien? Okay, cool. So actually, I also wanted to say that I made available the link to my master's levels course in sociolinguistics that takes place on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Si quieren saber más, or you just want to pop in and listen in, we talk about temas más específicos. Ahora mismo estamos introduction, pero en esa clase temas específicos. So if anyone wants to listen in, el link está en el e-courses de ustedes, el prontuario y eso. So you can have a look if anything like stands out to you. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you so much for participating at 7:30. Y pues si nos vemos presencial, va a haber café, promise. Okay? And I'll keep my promise because yo no puedo bregar sin café. All right, well, thank you so much. This class will be available online. You may leave.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
You too.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Déjame
I
saber.
was